Okay, there we go. Hey guys, how's it going? Hope all of you are doing well. I know it's been a little while since I did one of these cozy streams. I got sick a little recently, so that kind of threw things off. But I have a new streaming schedule. I posted it on my Telegram, posted it on Twitter, and I'm gonna stick pretty rigidly to that. But this one is not. These church father streams with Aarvoll aren't really on that streaming schedule, so these will be in addition to those. And so this is a continuation of this exploration, the study into the church fathers with uh, with Arwoll here, and yeah, we're going to be kind of diving right into this continuation here. So last time we wrapped up our study of Clement of Rome, who is largely considered to be uh, the 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 earliest um, witness to the apostolic tradition um, after the apostles. And so we're going to be just continuing on with this, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going through this little bit lesser known epistle, this little bit lesser known writing from the early church. It's called the Epistle to Diognetus by Mathetes. Now, this is likely dated, it's likely a second century work. It's sort of an anonymous author because Mathetes, it just means the student, so it's not really uh, this doesn't really carry like the sort of weight of a document that reflects a reputation of a known early church father per se, but it is a really good window into the thought of the early church, definitely. As far as who Diognetus is, there's no clear, definitive answer. We don't really know who he was. Some people theorize that he was a tutor to Marcus Aurelius. Some people theorize that he was an early, he was a city council member of some kind. But some people even theorize that he's sort of a fictional character, and that this dialogue is, or that this epistle is more to serve like catechetical purposes, not necessarily directed to an individual person per se. But that's a little bit lesser known. This really wasn't picked up very well by, or rather, I should say, it really wasn't picked up very much by the early church. There's no record of it being referenced or cited by the early fathers. However, it was one of the last surviving manuscripts was identified in the 13th century, and and that's when it started to be picked up again. So it's one of those lesser, like I said, one of those lesser known works. It didn't carry all that much authority in the early church, but it is a good window into the thought of the early church, which is one of the main reasons why we're doing this, to get a clearer understanding of the intellectual climate that reigned among those members of the early Christian community. So without further ado, Arwell, how are you doing? And then yeah, we can get started.
Yeah, doing well. We've had some scheduling issues,
Yeah.
not just with your illness, and I hope you are feeling better,
Oh
but
yeah.
good, good. Yeah, I read through this letter probably a month ago now, so it's not super fresh in my mind. I did enjoy it, and it does seem that there are some, philosophical kind of undertones, and it is a good window into that time period, even if it's not, so to speak, canonical church father material. It's sort of like in the study of Platonism, I think it's beneficial to read the Epinomis or the second Alcibiades, even though
Yeah.
probably these aren't composed by Plato, but it is from the Platonic school generally, and so is reflective of the currents of thought that were popular. And yeah, it's just good to get into that. And I'm here for these documents and to really get as good an understanding as I can of all the different data points. And so yeah, I'm really looking forward to this.
All right, great, wonderful. Yeah, I think we can kind of just get started. This is a shorter work, so this can take the format of kind of reading an excerpt, then talking about it, reading another excerpt, then talking about it. We'll be going up to the end of chapter 6, so it's really, I don't think it'll take us that long. And again, some of these passages there might not be much to say on, but there is, I think, quite a bit of philosophical content here that can, help engender good dialogue about the teachings of the church and whatnot. So, do you want to start us off, or do you want me to start us off with chapter 1?
Yeah, sure, I'll start.
Okay.
So, the Epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus, chapter 1, occasion of the epistle. Since I see thee, most excellent Diognetus, exceedingly desirous to learn the mode of worshipping God prevalent among the Christians, and inquiring very carefully and earnestly concerning them, what God they trust in, and what form of religion they observe, so as to look down upon the world itself, and despise death, while they neither esteem those to be gods that are reckoned such by the Greeks, nor hold to the superstition of the Jews. And what is the affection which they cherish among themselves, and why, in fine, this new kind or practice of piety has only now entered into the world, and not long ago. I cordially welcome this thy desire, and I implore God, who enables us both to speak and to hear, to grant me so to speak, that above all I may hear you who have been edified, and to you so to hear, that I who speak may have no cause of regret for having done so.
All right.
Right. So immediately, it sounds like he is talking to someone who is philosophically inclined, what he wants to understand, where this new doctrine has come from, some kind of common sense objections that a Hellenistic observer might have about Christianity. Why is it novel? It doesn't quite fit into Hellenistic paganism or Judaism. So what is this new doctrine? They mentioned the affection they cherish among themselves, which just is another testimony to the fact that the early Christian communities were primarily, distinguished by their mode of life and their charity and fellowship.
Yeah, and it is interesting, I think, how already we have a strong and firm desire on part of the early church to distinguish itself not only from uh, just the wider secular order, but specifically from Judaism. Um, there's sometimes a tendency to think that, oh, well, the early church was just like an offshoot of Judaism, and that it took a really long time for them to kind of recognize themselves as fully distinct from Judaism. But that's not necessarily, true. I mean, you did have, of course, the Judaizers who did sort of think of the church in that light, but no, I mean, you have very early on an insistence that uh, the revelation that was given to the Jews is continued in the life of the church, and that those Jews who had continued to pledge their faith in the old covenant, once the fullness of God's revelation in Christ comes onto the scene, well, those attachments to the former covenant become superstition by virtue of that fact, and I think that is recognized in this early testimony here.
Yeah, and something to just kind of look out for is exactly where that line is and how dissociated the author wants the Christians to be from the practices of the Jews. As I recall, there's really a stark contrast that's set up, and of course, different kind of factions within the church at this time had different levels of attachment to the older Jewish practices.
Yeah,
but
I think that in this epistle we see clearly someone firmly in the camp of wanting to distinguish,
right,
quite sharply. And there might be some who think, oh well, is this like proto-Marcionism? Is this sort of a precursor to Marcionist thought? And I don't think so. I don't think you can necessarily make that claim, because there's no disdain here for the practices of the old covenant. There's no notion that the practices from the old covenant come from some other supernatural, or rather, I shouldn't say supernatural. That's an imprecise use of the term, but there's no indication that Mathetes here thinks that the practices of the Old Covenant stem from some maybe diabolical source per se, which was the case in Marcionism. I think this is just to say that maintaining an attachment to Old Covenant practices becomes superstitious by virtue of the fact that they were instituted for the sake of prefiguring what would be fulfilled in Christ, and that once they had been fulfilled, well, you're really just rendering veneration and ultimately worship to an empty shell, and that is the very essence of superstition. So, so yeah, we can continue here, unless you had anything else to add.
No, that's great.
All right. Chapter 2, the vanity of idols. Come then, after you have freed yourself from all prejudices possessing your mind, and laid aside what you have been accustomed to, as something apt to deceive you, and being made, as if from the beginning, a new man, inasmuch as, according to your confession, you are to be the hearer of a new system of doctrine. Come and contemplate, not with your eyes only, but with your understanding, the substance and the form of those whom ye declare and deem to be gods. Is it not of them a stone similar to that on which we tread? Is not a second brass in no way superior to those vessels which are constructed for our ordinary use? Is not a third wood, and that already rotten? Is not a fourth silver, which needs a man to watch it, lest it be stolen? Is not a fifth iron consumed by rust? Is not a sixth earthenware in no degree more valuable than that which is formed for the humblest of purposes? Are not all of these of corruptible matter? Are they not fabricated by means of iron and fire? Did not the sculptor fashion one of them, the brazier a second, the silversmith a third, and the potter a fourth? Was not every one of them, before they were formed by the arts of those workmen, into shape of these gods, each in its own way subject to change? Would not those things which are now vessels, formed of the same materials, become like to such, if they met with the same artificers? Might not these, which are now worshipped by you, again be made by men vessels similar to others? Are they not all deaf? Are they not blind? Are they not without life? Are they not destitute of feeling? Are they not incapable of motion? Are they not all liable to rot? Are they not all corruptible? These things ye call gods. These ye serve. These ye worship. These ye become altogether like to them. For this reason ye hate the Christians, because they do not deem these to be gods. But do not ye yourselves, who now think and suppose such to be gods, much more cast contempt upon them than they, the Christians, do? Do ye not much more mock and insult them, when ye worship those that are made of stone and earthenware, without appointing any persons to guard them? But those made of silver and gold ye shut up by night, and appoint watchers to look after them by day, lest they be stolen? And by those gifts which ye mean to present to them, do ye not, if they are possessed of sense, rather punish than honor them? But if, on the other hand, they are destitute of sense, ye convict them of this fact, while ye worship them with blood and smoke of sacrifices. Let any one of you suffer such indignities. Let any one of you endure to have such things done to himself. But not a single human being will, unless compelled to it, endure such treatment, since he is endowed with sense and reason. A stone, however, readily bears it, seeing it is insensible. Certainly, you do not show by your own conduct that he, your God, is possessed of sense. And as to the fact that Christians are not accustomed to serve such gods, I might easily find many other things to say. But if even what has been said does not seem to anyone sufficient, I deem it idle to say anything further. Yeah, so it seems to me like what he's really doing here in this passage is attempting a philosophical refutation of pagan theology, which would locate divinity in that which is essentially composed of matter, that which is essentially of sense. Uh, and he seems to be pointing out various like inconsistencies in behavior um, that don't really match up to what their actual professed theology seems to be pertaining to uh, the the divinity of these gods, because he seems to be saying that, okay, well, you render some degree of worship to that which is you know of the world, and yet you the way in which you behave toward these material substances doesn't seem to reflect the kind of reverence you claim to have for these gods. So, like, how can you necessarily render worship to the material world if you are content with stepping on it and not necessarily you know showing radical reverence for even mundane physical objects, because they seem to be made of the same material, and therefore you should really be uh, showing more reverence in order to be consistent with your inward piety. um, I don't know how well this is really reflective of the kind of paganism that he's attacking, but so I was curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think this kind of polemic from Christians was definitely a factor in Iamblichus's kind of updated pagan theology
Yeah.
and updated like concepts of theurgy and such. These seem to have been problems around pagan worship and idolatry that were kind of genuine problems. I mean, these traditions went back before like Plato's philosophy and theology, which towards late antiquity, the last pagans, think of who's the apostate emperor? Was
Oh,
that
yeah, Julian the Apostate.
Julian? Yeah, Julian. Obviously is very much in this Iamblichian
Right.
Platonist school of thought, but it hadn't quite won out. And I think some of those more ancient modes of thinking of the gods were still prevalent. And I think it's that more ancient
Right.
approach to idolatry that is legitimately under attack here. And then Christianity comes across here as the kind of rational agent who's reconsidering these kind of outmoded superstitions on both the Jewish and pagan side of things. So rhetorically, it's very effective.
So
Um, yeah,
so you would kind of maybe see this in many ways, this kind of polemic, to really be in harmony, very much so, with maybe the Platonist polemic
to a certain extent,
to a
it
certain
require
degree.
well, Platonists like Iamblichus had to make very fine conceptual distinctions to
Right.
avoid these sorts of problems. So, like, yes, the spirit of the god indwells the idol, but it doesn't live or subsist in the material
Right.
substrate. It's like independent in some way. And but like the point that I really liked here is like, okay, if the idols have sensation, then why do you lock them up? Like, you wouldn't do that to a person, and yet this is your
Right.
god, you know.
Right. The way you
Or the
treat
point,
these things isn't consistent.
right? Or like, if the what is truly valuable about these things, which it ought to be, is that they house divine energies, then why is it that one's made out of clay or stone you just leave out, and then one's made of precious metal you lock up?
Right.
Clearly, it is the
And
material
it's like
thing.
it's the same material that you use for mundane purposes, like you use to drink out of a glass or you would use to walk on and
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm unaware of any more sophisticated theurgic, or I guess theurgical writings. There's from this time period. There are a couple other Julians who are known as like prophets. Basically, they write what become known as the Chaldean oracles, and there are signs of a kind of higher Platonic pagan theurgy practice there, but it's definitely not very well worked out, and it's not even clear that those were written by this time. I think those are also second century, but I think there's a dialectic going on between Christians and pagans, and the treatment of idols and exactly what the kind of ontological status of idols were for pagans is very much being influenced by Christianity. I think that's like a historical misconception that we can easily fall into, is that, paganism was older, Christianity came later. But just like, what we know today as Judaism came in a sense later than what we know as Christianity, like rabbinical, Talmudic Judaism.
Right.
Is kind of a first century invention, post Second Temple invention. So like the later Platonic, high Platonic paganism is already, I think, influenced by Christian arguments like this.
Interesting. Okay, I think we can move on.
Oh, yeah, that's me. Okay. Chapter 3, Superstitions of the Jews. And next, I imagine that you are most desirous of hearing something on this point, that the Christians do not observe the same forms of divine worship as do the Jews. The Jews, then, if they abstain from the kind of service above described, and deem it proper to worship one God as being Lord of all, are right. But if they offer him worship in the way which we have described, they greatly err. For while the Gentiles, by offering such things to those that are destitute of sense and hearing, furnish an example of madness, they, on the other hand, by thinking to offer these things to God as if he needed them, might justly reckon it rather an act of folly than of divine worship. For he that made heaven and earth, and all that is therein, and gives to us all the things of which we stand in need, certainly requires none of those things which he himself bestows on such as think of furnishing them to him. But those who imagine that, by means of blood and the smoke of sacrifices and burnt offerings, they offer sacrifices acceptable to him, and that by such honors they show him respect, these, by supposing that they can give anything to him who stands in need of nothing, appear to me in no respect to differ from those who studiously confer the same honor on things destitute of sense, and which therefore are unable to enjoy such honors.
Yeah, so he seems to be saying that the observances of the Jews that are divorced from their recognition of Christ as the Messiah really just circle back to pagan worship, because without without a recognition of, I guess, this new order of grace that is made available to us through the incarnation and the mystical body of Christ, these observances really only serve to try to appease God, as if those observances in themselves could bring that about without the actual grace and supernatural life that is mediated through these observances. So it's because, like, in the Christian understanding, whenever we engage in liturgical practices, whenever we participate in the sacramental life of the church, it is all understood that the power that these sacraments bring about is none other than the merits of Christ that were won for us on the cross. And so within the cross, you have the one acceptable sacrifice that's pleasing to God. The humble and contrite of the broken spirit, the humble and contrite heart, the pure heart. In other words, obviously Christ is not contrite for anything, but the purity of heart that is manifested through the sacrifice of the cross by virtue of the incarnation, that is what is pleasing to God, and it's that which animates any of the supernatural life that is to be found in the life of the church. So without that, without a recognition of the merits of Christ that animates these sacramental observances, you would only engage in these sacramental observances if they're not seen as a prefigurement of that, or if they are simply done for their own sake. Then it really just does amount to trying to curry favor with God through empty observances. And so really that's ultimately the same thing as like a pagan disposition.
Yeah, definitely. And later Neoplatonic pagan writers will be careful to integrate arguments like this. So when sacrifices are made to the gods, they make clear that this is not a case like the ancient pagan worship of I give so that you may give. That's not the relationship that Platonists in later antiquity describe, or I think even like that wasn't Plato's attitude. So this is something shared in common between the old paganism and the old covenant, seemingly. And it's interesting that he describes these Jewish practices not in terms of like an update to a covenant, like in the past these forms of worship were acceptable and now these other forms are acceptable. But it strikes me as more, we didn't really fully understand our relationship to God and God's, our mutual relationship with God to the sacrifices that we offer to him. And now with Christianity, this is an innovation, and we see, more clearly the correct, not that it's like a dispensation at one point in time, sacrifice in one way, and then that changes as a chronological effect of Christ's ministry, but rather like Christ reveals the eternal and more like philosophical truth of, you can't give appropriate sacrifice to God things that are, material, earthly, like the fat of the liver or whatever it is you're supposed to offer, like that can't possibly, like obviously God doesn't need that. And it's really presented as more like it was kind of foolish for anyone, pagan or Jewish, to believe that this was like an appropriate sacrifice to God. Like, Christ's sacrifice then just logically is the only like acceptable one. And then that in turn where we follow Christ's commandments of contrition and asceticism and, kind of chastising ourselves, picking up our own cross. And that's, it's a reconceptualization, conceptualization of what the sacrifice is. But it really strikes me as like, this is a truth that is revealed into the world, not that like a covenant has shifted and now we're going to do things in this way. It seems like the justification is philosophical, kind of logical, and it stands eternally. You know what I mean?
I think I would just add a distinction to that where I would say that if the old covenant is considered practiced without a hope for its fulfillment in the pure sacrifice of Christ, and if it is considered as the be-all and end-all of covenantal communion with God, then it does, I think, fall under this sort of condemnation from Mathetes here. But I don't think he's necessarily saying that the practices of the Old Covenant before the advent of Christ were in themselves necessarily. I don't think that he's saying that they necessarily amounted to what he is now calling superstitious practices, because what he would recognize, I think, is that the Jews at the time of his writing this are continuing these observances while rejecting the logic of the incarnation and the sacrifice of the cross. So when they're practiced while formally rejecting that, then they have no ultimate referent for the sake of which they were instituted, and they become sort of self-referential in that way. And when those observances are self-referential, when they are considered the be-all and end-all of covenantal communion, at that point they lose their divine signification, what they were really meant to foreshadow, and therefore they lose the very logic that would justify their existence ever. So I guess I would add that distinction there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you could easily. I don't see this in the document per se, but you could easily add that in the old covenant times, this was a preparation for the fuller, truer sacrifice that is suitable ultimately, but that it's something that we weren't collectively, or the Jews weren't ready for. But I would still say, like, it's certainly depicted as like inherently deficient, logically deficient, to attempt to propitiate God in this way. But at a certain point in time, that's a prefiguring, that is like preparing the notion of what the true sacrifice looks
Right.
like. And now that we know, we should recognize that was just kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
groundwork.
Because he's not really making any claims. Like, because if he were making the Marcionite claim, it seems like he would say that what was done in the past was superstitious. Um, he would probably try to construct some kind of a narrative for why uh, what was done in the past was evil when it was done in the past. But he doesn't really make that claim, and that's the only reason why I say I don't think he's really like a proto-Marcionite, even though I can see why someone might try to make that interpretation. Um, okay.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not like as sensitive to those heretical currents as you would be, so I'm probably reading him in more of a proto-Marcionite way. But yeah, I think definitely the reading that you suggested is fully possible, and also he is explaining to someone who seems a bit philosophically inclined, if in fact this is a real
Right.
historical person he's writing to.
Yeah.
So, like, he's giving the explanation that a philosophical person would be susceptible to. And doesn't Paul, at some point in one of the epistles, basically command us to have arguments ready for all sorts of people?
Yeah, that's I think in Peter's epistle, be ready to give a
Oh,
reason
Peter.
for the
Okay.
hope that is in you. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And but you mentioned Paul, and Paul is quite significant because when he has his when he preaches in the Areopagus, he does appeal to pagan sensibilities, right? Because he refers to the true God as as what really is the unknown God, where they had that 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 label for the unknown God, and he's saying that is actually a reference to the true God, the true God who's incarnate in Jesus Christ, etc. So, so he does try very much to try to tailor his messaging to the audience that he's speaking to, for sure. Okay, I can continue with chapter 4 here.
sounds good.
All right. So, chapter 4, the other observances of the Jews. But as to their scrupulosity concerning meats, and their superstition as respects the Sabbaths, and their boasting about circumcision, and their fancies about fasting and the new moons, which are utterly ridiculous and unworthy of notice, I do not think that you require to learn anything from me. For to accept some of those things which have been formed by God for the use of men as properly formed, and you reject others as useless and redundant, how can this be lawful? And to speak falsely of God, as if he forbade us to do what is good on the Sabbath days, how is this not impious? And the glory of circumcision of the flesh as proof of election, and as if on account of it they were specially beloved by God, how is this not subject to ridicule? And as to their observing months and days, as if waiting upon the stars and the moon, and their distributing, according to their own tendencies, the appointments of God, and the vicissitudes of the seasons, some for festivities and others for mourning, who would deem this a part of divine worship, and not much rather a manifestation of folly. I suppose, then, that you are sufficiently convinced that the Christians properly abstain from the vanity and error common to both Jews and Gentiles, and from the busybody spirit of vain boasting of the Jews. But you must not hope to learn the mystery of their peculiar mode of worshiping God from any mortal.
Right. So more like BTFOing Judaism. I don't
Well,
know.
yeah, I mean, it really is trying to lean pretty heavily into that. I mean, I'm wondering to what extent he is he's criticizing these practices. I mean, because on the one hand, it seems like, yeah, he is clearly talking about the, the continuation of these observances that are empty, absent their connection to Christ. On the other hand, there's really no way of knowing how integrated he is within the early sacramental practices of the church, which are recognized by other early fathers, by other apostolic fathers. Um,
Yeah. No, I mean, when did Marcion live?
that was, I just want to get this right.
Because some of these heresies, before they're recognized, even, it kind of accepted church fathers um, seem to uh, hold to some of these positions, like
Yeah,
uh, monophysitism.
right. And Marcion was also second century, so I mean, it might be that there is potentially some kind of an overlap here, but again, Marcionism, in order to justify its rejection of the old covenant, like introduces this metaphysics where uh, the observances of the old covenant stemmed originally from some diabolic origin, and that's not claimed here. Uh, so
Right,
yeah,
right. Not explicitly. He speaks of them as basically being in error, and there is some impiety, though, in like this sentence here, and to speak falsely of God as if he forbade us to do what is good on the Sabbath days. How is this? How is not
see,
this
that
impious?
seems to me like an implicit uh, condemnation of what Jesus was condemning.
Right. He's agreeing with Jesus, definitely echoing Jesus's words about that. Who, if your ox or whatever falls in a hole on the Sabbath,
Right,
doesn't,
right, right,
these
exactly.
remarks.
So he might
Um,
be referring to the kind of superstitions that even in Jesus's times were attached to the observances of the old covenant, even when they were in force.
right. What does Jesus really accuse the Jews of his day, the Pharisees especially, of doing? It's sort of like a reification fallacy. God commands one thing, and you take the most literal, most like word based
Right.
interpretation instead of like getting the spirit of it. So, certainly, if all of these sacrifices and the schedule of rites in Judaism were a propedeutic to the true Christian worship, then they had an appropriate function. But then once you kind of make them into idols, once you reify them, um, then they become problematic. And
Yeah.
Jews were starting to do that even before the appearance of Christ, and now after Christ's mission, then it really does
Yeah.
not make sense to maintain those practices.
Yeah, I mean these practices really came into full force after the Maccabean revolt and the independence of the Jews at that time, which formed the various factions of Judaism that Jesus had engaged with. With the Pharisees, with the distinctions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, etc. And I think it's out of that tradition that had emerged where you get so many of these excesses, and yeah, I think that once it's recognized, the divinity of Christ is recognized, and the sacrifice of Christ is recognized as a true fulfillment of all of these old practices, then all of those observances on their face become absurd to continue them
Right.
in any way. And they become inherently superstitious because they're not observed in light of what they were meant to foreshadow. And it's similar to other things too. When Israel is invoked, when Zion is invoked, when Jerusalem is invoked in the praying of the Psalms, if those covenantal realities are not directed to what they were meant to fulfill, it just becomes empty ethno-narcissism. It just becomes like a rather evil kind of a idolatry of your own race. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I think those are the kinds of sentiments that I'm really picking up from this text.
Hmm. Eventually, we'll get to some of the church fathers who really discussed the kind of like typology
Yeah,
and interpreting Old Testament narratives in terms of this foreshadowing. Some of them went to the extreme, I think, some of these later church fathers, of basically saying that many seemingly historical narratives are really just for the kind of symbolical foreshadowing value, and we shouldn't necessarily take them too literally. That reached, if I remember from like this one book that I read on the church fathers broadly, and I'd like a much fuller understanding, of course. I think that like peaked in the mid third
yeah.
century,
Well, a lot of
and
that came from certain segments of the Alexandrian school, because certain segments of the Alexandrian school were really big, and it's not just Christian, by the way. I, that kind of allegorism, I think, was in some ways a repurposing of Philo of Alexandria's allegorism,
hmm,
because Philo had tried to introduce some allegorist readings of you know at the time was just like the scriptures, um, not necessarily deriving any literal or historical value from some of those passages, but directly cutting right to the core of its spiritual meaning, its anagogical reading, and I think that sort of allegorist tradition that wasn't partially, I would say, informed by an attachment to Platonism, which Philo had, um, was picked up by fathers in the Alexandrian school, like most notably Origen of Alexandria, who is really big on allegorist interpretations of Old Testament passages and pericopes and narratives and etc. I think it's a tradition that doesn't originate with the Christians, but actually I think originates in kind of Philonic approaches to exegesis.
yeah, I think that's a good theory of this mindset. And I think the author of this epistle may be in that school of thought to some degree. But there's two ways of approaching that. You can either say that, this is a matter of correct interpretation of the scriptures, and we should read certain scriptures as more allegorical or more as, foreshadowing things and less significant in their literal sense,
Yeah,
which could be reinforced by,
yeah,
statements like it's the spirit, not the letter of the law, and Jesus fulfills the law and yet seems to abrogate certain things. And so, how can that be a
yeah,
fulfillment unless this more like allegorical interpretation in certain places is correct? And then where it would fall into heresy would probably be where, like Marcion, like, no, like these actual documents, the
or
Old
from the
Testament,
devil.
come from the devil. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's either hermeneutic or it's kind of breaking the
right.
canon. and we don't really know what the author of this epistle has in mind.
Yeah, I don't know if he's really of the kind of I don't know if he's even aware so much of like allegorism per se, because like he's kind of talking about observances and practices, not necessarily of like what God did in the past, or like the story or narrative of the Israelites, but but it is a similar kind of mindset for sure. Because he's really saying, let's just move on. Let's just think of all of these observances purely in terms of their fulfillment in Christ, and let's just consider them currently as utterly worthless because they are in light of Christ. Um, so yeah, I think we can maybe continue with chapter 5 here.
Okay. Chapter 5, the manners of the Christians. For the Christians are distinguished from other men neither by country, nor language, nor the customs which they observe. For they neither inhabit cities of their own, nor employ a peculiar form of speech, nor lead a life which is marked out by any singularity. The course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men, nor do they, like some, proclaim themselves the advocates of any merely human doctrines, but inhabiting Greek as well as barbarian cities, according as the lot of each of them has been determined, and following the customs of the natives in respect of clothing, food, and the rest of their ordinary conduct, they display to us their wonderful and confessedly striking method of life. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as if foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do all others, they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things, and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled, and bless. They are insulted, and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners, and are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. This is a very interesting way from a rhetorical perspective to present Christianity. So he's like knocked down the alternatives of Judaism and paganism really effectively. And then when it comes to Christianity, it's all of these paradoxes and kind of puzzles.
It's really
definitely
beautiful.
Yeah.
Now, I could be wrong, and I probably am wrong, but I think this passage that we just read might be in the Office of Readings for the Liturgy of the Hours, just because it is such a profound kind of way of getting at what is the true relationship between the sojourning Christian, the viator, the relationship between him and the world that he finds himself in. That it's kind of really trying to get at what is the perfect balance between utterly ignoring the world on the one hand and being too integrated in the dynamics of the world. Really trying to get at what is the perfect tone of detachment that the Christian is to have with the world that he finds himself in. And I think he explains it so beautifully through these paradoxes, through these contrasts that we're supposed to be. Yes, we're supposed to dwell in our countries, but we are sojourners. We're not spiritually attached necessarily to our countries. And there might be a lot of people there might be some people watching who have nationalist sympathies, etc. And I say, well, how can we read that in light of our political ambitions? And I would say that, like, if nationalism is considered detached from Christianity, I think it is an idol, because you you would see your homeland as sort of the highest good, and that's something the church has always condemned. But if you dwell in your homeland as a spiritual sojourner, then as part of your journey, you're going to want to sanctify your homeland. You're going to want to subject it to the kingship of Christ. So it's not necessarily saying to disregard the fact that it is your homeland, but as your homeland, you should have a certain kind of healthy detachment from it, so that you would want to sanctify it. So it's really getting at this kind of detachment from the world, the flesh, and the devil that we really have to cultivate, and that really marks the hallmark of the Christian as distinct from the pagan and from the Jew, because the Jew retains a spiritually unhealthy attachment to his fatherland, to his race, to his blood, and that kind of distinguishes him as a Jew, and that is something that the Christian has to disregard. Like, the Christian has to transcend that category in the spiritual order, not disregard it in the material order, but to disregard it in the spiritual order. The blood does not, in itself, is not a measurement for one's closeness to God. And so I think that's how it's distinguished from Judaism, and of course likewise to paganism. Not seeing, not identifying God's subsistent presence with the world of sensation in any way, except insofar as we consider the incarnation, but that's quite a different matter altogether. So I think it is a really well written and well articulated way of distinguishing Christianity from both Judaism and paganism by way of these paradoxes.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the Christians do live in the countries. How did he phrase it? According as the lot of each of them has determined. So, like, there is some kind of providence in finding yourself in a particular country. So it's not for nothing that you exist in a particular Greek or barbarian city in these days. You're there for a reason. You follow the custom of the natives, like you assimilate and are not of the country you're living in, but you're not against it. You don't break the laws of the country that you're in. You respect the authority of the country that you're in, and yet kind of subtly through these actions that aren't explicitly political, you're really serving this higher kingdom that you have your kind of highest allegiance to.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was part of, I've never really thought of this before, but it's sort of a dual loyalty argument for why Christians might have been persecuted.
Well, yeah, I think that's certainly, I don't know if it would have been expressed precisely in those terms, but yeah, well, it was because they lacked the kind of allegiance that was required for to the sovereign, because the Christian was so fundamentally disinterested in the affairs of the state, and that was a major reason, because they were taking people away from the kind of patriotism that was expected of them.
Right. One
so
other
it was kind
interesting,
of seen as like a domestic terror threat.
yeah, right. They're talking about this new kingdom, and
Yeah.
Yeah, what exactly do you have
dethroning
planned?
the emperor in a way, uh,
Mm-hmm.
denying of him the title that was integral to what it meant to be an upstanding citizen. And of course, being an upstanding citizen is a national security interest. you know,
Right. Yeah.
making sure that the public orthodoxy of the realm is not undermined, is not threatened. So I mean, this really did constitute a national security threat, and it's why if you have a country that is secular, that is not like a an overtly Catholic or Christian country, I think Christianity becomes by necessity a national security threat in a certain way. Because it is so disinterested in uh, the affairs of the state for its own sake.
Right. Yeah. Interesting that
So I
this kind
actually
of
understand the
commitment.
rationale for why radical Catholics are put on the watch lists. I get
Oh
it.
yeah.
It makes sense. It's logical because it is a national security threat in a certain way to a secular order. It's always going to be.
Right. And yet, as he puts it at the end, those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. It is this kind of vague threat of what they might do, but when you look to their actual actions, they're not violating laws. They're, not going against local
Right.
customs. They just kind of exceed the laws in these virtuous ways. It sort of reminds me of the way that Socrates in I think book 6 of the Republic talks about how basically like the true philosophers will always meet with resistance by
Yeah.
the many. And so here like the true Christians who are not following any human doctrine but like a higher wisdom. By the way, that is also how like the Platonic philosophy is framed in the dialogues. Very often Socrates gets an inspiration from the god or some god or something along those lines. It's not generally characterized as a human doctrine, even in
Right.
Plato. But there's definitely a symmetry there. And I thought, though, there is a distinction from a kind of Platonic position that many would have been familiar with. Like famously, Plotinus was going to try to institute a society along the lines spelled out in the Republic with the sanction of the Roman emperor at the time. But for some reason or another, it didn't pan out. But that is argued against here. So they say the course of conduct which they follow has not been devised by any speculation or deliberation of inquisitive men. So it's not that they've devised some philosophy, like the idea of the ideal city in the Republic, and then they're going to carry out this new way of life. There are also other examples outside of Platonism of people doing that. I mean, there were like utopian
Right.
cults in this, especially actually in the first century AD. It was a pretty common thing. Um, so distinguishing themselves from that, characterizing the Christians as more like receiving fittingly this common spirit that kind of subtly organizes them in this way where they can render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and yet render to God what is God's and not explicitly violate anything and yet still people hate them even though they benefit all these people. So it's just a real, in the same way that like Socrates spells out the merits of the philosopher partly by the contrast with the many. So here, like the contrast with the many who are condemning the Christians really just highlights the virtue of the Christians. So the antinomy and paradoxes kind of, highlights how the Christians are not against, the world and worldly powers, and yet in a profound sense, simultaneously kind of transcend these things. And that's why the resentment, but it's just a very, interesting chapter.
Yeah,
And
and it is kind of in striking this balance that they're targeted. It's because they strike this balance that they're targeted in many ways. Because if they would have just been pure ascetics, not really even interested in living in the world, uh, then they wouldn't have attracted very many people for one, and for two, they'd be easily ignorable. And so I don't think they would have really been considered much of a threat. But the fact that they are striking this balance between being in the world but not of the world, uh, they're demanding things of the secular order in a certain way, and they're not going to be content until they sanctify and evangelize the culture, which would necessarily amount to a certain dethroning of the current sovereign. And so there's that, but there's even this additional layer of, you know, the Christian's integration into a secular society includes certain juridical obligations, like a parallel juridical body, namely the church. So, like, not only is the individual sojourning Christian trying to, in some way, undermine the, or rather, I should say, trying to radically alter the political structure of the society that he's in, retains a certain juridical allegiance to a separate parallel institution. Um, and so this is always going to come under hostility in a non-Christian polity. Always, it has to,
Right. Yeah, Jesus says
because it
like
is
they
a
will.
zero-sum game.
Jesus warns they will hate you for his namesake, and yeah, it seems to always pan out that way. One other last interesting thing was just the explicit mention that Christians never condone abortion,
Yeah.
and just underlines like that is one issue. You know, many people consider it like a culture
Yep.
war
That's in
issue,
the
but
Didache
it's
as well.
yeah, it's in the most ancient Christian sources. There's really, I don't think, any ancient Christian source that ever condones abortion.
Yeah,
So
and the only ambiguities that come up are really in the Middle Ages, where there's this adoption of Aristotelian embryology, um, but that never condones abortion. All that does is ask the question: okay, when, at what point is a separate human subsistence? At what point does that come into being? And therefore, what penalties are to be justly attributed to abortion in like the earliest stage. But it was always considered as either proximate to homicide or homicide itself.
I mean, it's really interesting. So many ancient cultures routinely practiced
Right. Yep.
infanticide and abortion. And, you know, it's not really, I don't think it's present in the New Testament all that much. And yet Christians universally, under the influence of the Spirit, found this once prevalent practice morally repugnant.
Right,
And,
because it's not spelled out in Scripture. I mean, the liberals are
right.
right about that. It's not spelled out in Scripture, and it's not even the most intuitive moral doctrine. And that's evidenced by the fact that it was so widely practiced, even just full out infanticide, as you know. Uh, so so yeah, I mean, you make a really important point there, that it is the influence of the Spirit. It's one of those, I would argue, actually, I think, the the per se immorality, grave immorality of abortion is sort of one of those things that pertains to divine tradition in addition to sacred scripture. So we have these two sources of divine revelation in Catholic, in the Catholic understanding, where you have these two sources that you have sacred scripture, which is divine inspiration, but sacred tradition, which is basically the witness of the apostles to considered as an attestation to divine revelation through the oral preaching of the apostles. That's divine tradition. That's constitutive divine tradition. And I think the immorality of abortion is like one of those things, one of those sort of divinely revealed truths that are, it's not exactly spelled out in sacred scripture, but was nevertheless orally preached by the apostles as a witness to that primordial divine revelation that's given to
Was
them
it
through
ever
the apostles.
practiced in Judaism? I
Well,
mean, I know
there
in recent times, yeah, but
are there the Talmud, as far as I know, I haven't studied this very extensively, but I'm kind of going off of Jewish authorities themselves here, where they do say that like the Talmud does provide allowances for abortion, and of course you have in Exodus, or I don't remember which one it is, but you have like an Old Testament provision for like a certain penalty that's ascribed to uh, someone who wounds a pregnant woman, and basically the end result of that is that the penalty is considered less if like the abortion inadvertently takes place. But that's not in itself any kind of like because that just seems to be like that's like how manslaughter is different from murder. Like that carries different penalties to it. So like the liberals will bring that up as if that's some kind of like a pro-choice scripture, but no, I mean that's like that's true if even if it was like you accidentally like ran someone over negligently, or like you were intending to wound like a mother carrying her baby, but and you ended up wounding the baby. Like that's just kind of that, because the penalty is going to be measured by like the malice, the intent, what's in the mind, right? Uh, so that's never been really a good argument to me. But that's really the only reference that you have uh, in the Old Testament. But the Talmud is a little bit more explicit in carving out certain allowances for abortion. But the Christians have always been consistent about this.
And it seems like they're really the source of it. I mean, I don't know of any
In a lot
other,
of ways, I think you're right. I mean, uh,
like Plato condones it in the
yeah,
Republic. You know,
right.
it's kind of recommended if a child has
Exactly.
deformities.
Exactly.
So,
It is kind of a novel thing in a way, isn't it?
yeah, it's something that I think anyone who allows the influence of the Spirit will see is a moral truth, but it's very hard to reason to, you know,
Yeah,
just from utilitarian arguments. But,
right. Right. And I think sometimes like the pro-life movement doesn't give that element of thinking enough credit. They kind of think it's just obviously intuitive. And even when I was an atheist, I didn't support abortion. But that's because we have been blessed with centuries of Christian thought on this issue.
right.
Anyway, uh, we'll do our last chapter here. I'm a little bit stuffy. Do you mind reading this last one for us?
Yeah, no problem. So, chapter 6, the relation of Christians to the world. To sum up all in one word, what the soul is in the body, that are Christians in the world. The soul is dispersed through all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered through all the cities of the world. The soul dwells in the body, yet is not of the body, and Christians dwell in the world, yet are not of the world. The invisible soul is guarded by the visible body, and the Christians are known indeed to be in the world, but their godliness remains invisible. The flesh hates the soul and wars against it, though itself suffering no injury, because it is prevented from enjoying pleasures. The world also hates the Christians, though in no wise injured, because they abjure pleasures. The soul loves the flesh that hates it, and loves also the members. Christians likewise love those that hate them. The soul is imprisoned in the body, yet preserves that very body. And Christians are confined in the world as in a prison, and yet they are the preservers of the world. The immortal soul dwells in a mortal tabernacle, and Christians dwell as sojourners in corruptible bodies, looking for an incorruptible dwelling in the heavens. The soul, when but ill provided with food and drink, becomes better. In like manner, the Christians, though subjected day by day to punishment, increase the more in number. God has assigned them this illustrious position, which it were unlawful for them to forsake.
So this is a really beautiful description of how Christians are relate to the world, and it's actually picked up by the magisterium itself. Pope Leo the 13th, he uses the soul body analogy for describing how uh, the church ought to relate to the state. In other words, the soul's sort of love of the body is such that it is a perfective love. The soul uh, bestows upon the body the principle of its own animation, the principle of its own perfection, and the body in turn receives the soul, the life of the soul, and is able to nurture that life that is given to it in order to constitute the complete person. And that relationship is not only, you know, a relationship between the soul and the body. It doesn't only refer to that, but it also is at its root a nuptial kind of relationship, actually. This is also picked up by Pope Innocent III when he writes his Fourfold Kinds of Marriages treatise, where the this relationship between the soul and the body is the very same kind of relationship between a husband and a wife, between between the Christ and the church, between the logos and the human nature that he assumes, between God and the world. It is really at its heart a nuptial union, and so the kind of relationship, therefore, that obtains between the Christian and the world is really should be a nuptial kind of a union, where where the Christian takes on the sort of active, like, husband role, and the world is sort of to take on this more passive yet also nurturing uh, wifely role, because what the Christian can give to the world can be therefore nurtured through the various organs of, like, secular and cultural life, and new life therefore can be brought about as a result of that one flesh union between the Christian and the world. And it's also, you know, obviously the example he's giving is the one between the soul and the body, and it's the same kind of a dynamic there, where the soul gives the body the principle of its life, and then the body receives that life and brings about a new kind of embodied perfection. And that is really the kind of dynamic that's supposed to be at play between the Christian and the world. The very same kind of perfection that the soul gives to the body is the kind of perfection that the Christian is to give to the world that he finds himself in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he seems to be building off of a lot of Platonic concepts
Absolutely.
here.
This is a really sophisticated, I would say, account.
Right. The soul as imprisoning the body is explicitly discussed in the dialogues. It's a Pythagorean trope as well. And actually, Plutarch, the author of the Parallel Lives of Greeks and Romans, Platonist, Middle Platonist, he says, when discussing like how the soul rules the body, he says that the soul rules the body as a husband rules his wife.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I don't know if anyone before Plutarch had said that explicitly, but definitely this is not simply that. It's also going beyond and drawing that comparison with the relation of Christians to the world. And this would have been very compelling. And this is why, Christianity is kind of a natural development, not just from Judaism, but from Platonism, because, there ought to be, just like there's a highest ruling principle in our body that is integrated, there ought to be one subtly integrating factor to the world at large. And it's that kind of global eschatological ambition and the idea of the heavenly kingdom that goes beyond the merely human doctrines of the ideal city from the Republic.
Absolutely.
It is worth noting, though, that technically Plato never describes, he never gets into the idea of the fate of the world as a whole. When describing like the ideal city, he does describe the ideal like warring city, the ideal bellicose state. In the very beginning of the Republic, describing like the ideal town, he describes a really simple lifestyle and like no weapons and no special guardian class and that sort of thing. Just to say that like this is something that Proclus does when interpreting Plato. We shouldn't take him to be giving the absolute ideal in the Republic or in the laws. Instead, like he's addressing like what is the best that these given people can accomplish. And in fact, that's the way that Socrates approaches almost all of his interlocutors. He doesn't just give the one doctrine, and it's similar to the way that this author is approaching his audience. He's understanding, he's coming from a philosophical perspective, he is tailoring his arguments to the person he's addressing. Socrates kind of does the same, even to the extent where sometimes he will sort of bend the true doctrine in order to give the interlocutor the point that he needs. I guess you could look at that as a sort of noble lie. And I'm not suggesting that the author of this document is engaging in it, but yeah, a lot of Platonic themes here, and definitely a beautiful image and a natural kind of development. I really put stock in the account. I forget where it comes from, but during Christ's descent into hell after the crucifixion, Plato is like the first to convert. And it's stuff like this that makes me think, yeah, probably.
Yeah, and it's this is really is. I just want to say one last thing about it. It's like one of the early integralist readings from the early fathers. I mean, you can't read this passage in any other way, right? He's really is, and it's so beautiful that this had been picked up by the popes. I don't even think this passage in particular, but this analogy has been picked up by the popes to describe the proper relationship between church and the state. It's a very Leonine idea. Anyway, so that'll kind of conclude it for today. Thank you very much, Aarvoll, for coming on. I really enjoy doing these, and we're kind of back to doing them now. So, yeah, do you have any last words that you want to say? If not, that's cool.
Nothing in particular. We're going to move to Saturdays around this time.
Yeah.
Hopefully that works out. Because I definitely want to get through all of these documents, the lesser known ones, the more well known ones. And I think next time we've decided we're doing the Didache, which should be really, we have to finish with
we'll finish this and then the next time we do the Didache, yeah.
Right, okay. Sounds great, and looking forward to it.
Great, awesome. God bless you all.